Hello and welcome. My name's Mike Thomas and I'll be your instructor on this session. I'm an IT trainer with over 30 years experience. I've spent most of my life in the corporate world, but since August last year, so just over a year ago, I've been working for myself. And although I deliver training on a wide variety of applications, for the past few years, I've chosen to focus on Excel and Power BI. In January 2024, I was named a Microsoft MVP in recognition of my continuing contributions to the global Excel community. But that's enough about me. So, without further ado, let's have a look at dynamic array functions in Excel. When we talk about dynamic array functions in Excel, many people think we're talking about the new functions that Microsoft have added to the program since 2020, such as unique, filter, VSTACK, sequence, and choose calls. And yes, those functions are described by Microsoft as dynamic array functions, but there's actually a lot more to dynamic arrays than a bunch of new functions. In the first part of this session, I'm going to explain the concept of dynamic arrays, and then I'll show you some of the new functions and how they work. By the way, I'll be using Excel on the Mac, but as far as dynamic arrays are concerned, they're exactly the same whether you're on Windows or the Mac. To understand what dynamic arrays are and why they're such a big deal, we first need to look at how formulas and functions traditionally worked in Excel. Here's a really simple example, but it illustrates the point I want to get across. I have a set of numbers down column A. They represent the number of people who attended 5 training courses. In column B, I need to enter some formulas to calculate the revenue generated from each course. Let's say the cost of each course is £100 per person. So in B2, I enter equals A2 multiplied by 100 and then copy it down. So we have 5 cells in column B. Each cell contains a formula. Therefore, we have 5 formulas. Yes, I know, I'm stating the obvious, but bear with me. Each formula generates a value, so we have 5 values. Again, I'm stating the obvious. Here's another similar scenario. Down column E, I have some names written in lowercase. In column F, I want an uppercase version of those names. And to do this, I can use the upper function. So I go to F2 and type equals upper, open brackets, and then select E2. Close the brackets, enter. I now have an uppercase version of what's in E2. To get the names down column F, I need to copy that function or formula down, and we have what we've asked for. Again, we have 5 cells in column F. Each cell contains a formula, well, a function if we're going to be pedantic. So we have 5 functions. Each function generates a value, so we have 5 values. So to summarize, each formula generates a single value. So that's how formulas and functions have worked since Excel was first released back in 1985. But with the introduction of dynamic arrays back in 2020, there's now a much better way to work with formulas and functions. Just before we jump into dynamic arrays, a quick note. Dynamic arrays are only available in Excel 365, Excel 2021 and Excel 2024. So if you're using Excel 2019 or an older version, dynamic arrays unfortunately won't be available to you. So I'm going to delete the formulas in column B and column F. In B2, I'm again going to enter a formula to calculate the revenue per course, but I'm going to enter it in slightly differently. Start in the same way with an equals, but instead of specifying A2, I'm going to select A2 to A6 and then multiply that by 100. All I've done differently, as I said, is instead of specifying a single cell, A2, I've specified a range, A2 to A6, and multiplied the range by 100. In Excel 2019 or earlier, this would have resulted in an error, because in those versions of Excel, you can't multiply a range of cells by a number. But if I press Enter, in Excel 365, 2021 and 2024, it generates a set of values. The values that we get in column B are the same values that we got in the previous demo, but it's what's going on behind the scenes that's different. Look at column B. We see 5 values, 1 in each cell from B2 to B6, same as before. But here's the important part. There's only one formula, not 5 formulas. The formula is in B2 and it returns 5 values. So now we have a new concept, a single formula that can return more than one value. The 5 values that are returned by the formula are known as an array. Even though the formula in B2 generates 5 values, those 5 values can't all be stored in the one cell. So Excel automatically places the additional 4 values in B3 to B6. And this is known as spilling. The values spill into the adjacent cells down the column. And B2 to B6, yes, I've included the cell where I actually type the formula, is called a spill range. When I click into any of the cells in B2 to B6, you'll notice a few things. A blue border. This indicates the boundary of the spill range. If I click away from column B, that blue border disappears. If I click back in column B, it reappears. The formulas in the formula bar are greyed out, apart from the one where I actually typed the formula in B2. And if you try to type into one of the cells in the spill range, except the one you type the formula into, so for example B4, if I just type ABC and press Enter, Excel will let you, but that breaks the spill range. The formula in B2 returns a spill error because it no longer has enough empty space to return all its results. To fix it, you just delete the contents of the cell that's in the way, in this case B4, and everything will spill again. Sometimes it's not obvious which cell is causing the problem. So say I typed a space character into B4, purely by accident of course. I then get distracted by a colleague calling me on Teams, and when I return to the spreadsheet 20 minutes later, I can't remember which cell I typed into. Going down column B looking in the formula bar won't help, because as you can see, all the cells apart from B2 in the formula bar, there's nothing in there. But what I can do is I can select B2, click the little warning icon just to the left, and click Select Obstructing Cells. And that takes me straight to the cell where I've actually got some content. I press Delete and all the values spill down again. I can use the same concept to generate the names in column F. So I'll go over to F2 and put equals upper open brackets, but instead of specifying E2, I'll specify E2 through to E6. Again, in Excel 2019 or earlier, this would have resulted in an error because those versions of Excel don't allow you to have a range inside the brackets of the upper function. You can only specify a single cell. But in Excel 365, 2021 and 2024, it works. It generates one formula which lives in F2. That formula generates 5 results and Excel spills those results down the column. Let's do one more example. In column I have expense amounts. The company policy is that anything over £200 requires manager approval. Each cell in the range J2 through to J6 contains an if formula. I'll just double click on J2 and we can see the formula. So if I2 is greater than 200, put yes, otherwise put no. If I3 is greater than 200, put yes, otherwise put no, and so on. So I'm going to delete J3 to J6. I'll leave the first formula there. I'll edit J2 and I'll change I2 to be I2 through to I6. So what I'm doing there is specifying a range instead of a single cell. And when I press enter, I get a spill range. At this point, I often find that many people are still trying to understand the real benefit of dynamic arrays. On the surface, it looks like all I've done is use a range in a formula instead of a single cell reference. And yes, that generates multiple values, which means I don't have to copy the formula down. And that's definitely a benefit. And having fewer formulas does mean a smaller file size and faster calculation. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Dynamic arrays give you one formula that spills, and that reduces errors, simplifies auditing, and prevents somebody accidentally overwriting part of a copied down range. And those are just a few reasons why dynamic arrays are so valuable. As we get further into this session, I'm sure you'll discover even more reasons to start using them in your own work. Another question I often get asked about dynamic arrays is about creating them. And this is usually along the lines of, so all you do is replace a reference to a single cell with a reference to a range and you have a dynamic array. Well, based on the examples I've shown so far, that would appear to be the case, but that's not 100% true. Not every formula that includes a reference to a range, as opposed to a reference to a single cell, generates a spill range. Let me show you what I mean. Here, I want to know the total revenue generated from the bookings for the training courses. So in B12, I'll put equals sum, open brackets, B2 to B6. Close the brackets and enter. That formula references a range, B2 to B6, but it doesn't generate multiple values. It generates one value, the sum of B2 to B6. So that, despite the fact it's referencing a range, is not a dynamic array. So that's the array part of dynamic arrays. What about the dynamic part? To most people, the word dynamic, especially in Excel, means automatically updating. That's not quite true. If I go to A7 and enter 40, it doesn't automatically expand the formulas in column B. Even though the formula in B2 is a dynamic array formula, it doesn't spill into B7. I'll need to go up to B2, edit it and change the reference to A6 to be A7 and then press enter. The dynamic in dynamic arrays refers to how Excel can spill a formula's result into multiple cells automatically without you needing to copy it down. If you want a truly dynamic setup, where you add a row to the source data and the formula updates, you need to convert the source data into a table. A table in Excel is a structured range of data that automatically expands as you add new rows or columns. Earlier, I did an example using expenses. This is a similar example, but here approval is required if the amount is over 100. Columns A to C contain regular data, numbers and text. Column D contains a formula that generates a spill range. I know that the number of rows of data will increase as more expenses are submitted, and I don't want to keep having to edit the formula that's in D2. So I'll convert columns A to C into a table. Notice I said A to C, not A to D. That's because tables and dynamic arrays, and I have a dynamic array formula in column D, tables and dynamic arrays don't play nicely together. If I included column D in the table, I'd get a spill error in D2. Let me show you. I've gone to cell A1. I'll press Ctrl T, which is the keyboard shortcut to create a table, check the settings, and you'll notice that it's automatically included column D, which I'm going to leave for a minute, and click OK. You can see straight away that we have a spill error in D2. So what I'm going to do is just undo that. That turns it back into a standard range instead of a table. Recreate the table by pressing Ctrl T again, but this time changing it from column A to D to be column A to C, and click OK. Now the table doesn't include column D. I'm just going to tidy up that table a little bit. So on the Table tab or Table Design on Windows, I'm going to untick Filter button. That removes the drop downs from the header row. And I'm also going to go to the Table Styles, click the little drop down and select Clear. And that clears the formatting. I'll also rename the table to Expenses. If I go to the Table tab, on the very left hand side of the ribbon we have the table name. It's called it Table 7. I could have kept it as Table 7, but I like to give my tables meaningful names, so I'll call it Expenses. And then I'll go and add another row of data. So if I go to A7 and let's put in employee number 2222, and the details we'll have as a hotel, and the amount is 130, you can see that it's automatically extended the formula down column D. Recently, during a course, I was talking about dynamic arrays, and somebody said that whilst they totally understood how they work and that one formula is more efficient, they weren't sure if they'd use them. Probably because they were used to working in the old way. And I totally get that. And based on what I've shown you so far, I wouldn't blame some of you watching this session if you're thinking the same. However, since 2020, which as I said earlier, was when dynamic arrays were added to Excel, Microsoft have added quite a lot of new functions to the program. And unlike the older functions like upper and if, which, depending on what you put in the brackets, either generate a spill range or don't generate a spill range, these new functions, which are designed to let you do things in Excel which you couldn't do before, or if you could, it would take a really complicated formula. These new functions are built as dynamic arrays right off the bat. So they will generate a spill range. They will have all the formulas except the first one grayed out, and they might generate a spill error. The same will be true for functions that Microsoft add to Excel in the future. In other words, to get the best out of Excel, you do really need to understand the concept of dynamic array functions. So, having gone through what dynamic array functions are and shown you how you can make some of the older functions act as dynamic array functions, it's time to have a look at some of those new functions. There's about 30 new functions, maybe more, that have been added to Excel since 2020, but unfortunately, I've only got time to cover a few. Let's start with the filter function. Everybody loves the filter function. It's probably one of my favourite ones because it has so many uses. It's one of those functions like VLOOKUP that if you've never used it before and you see it in action, it's like, wow, I can see so many uses for that. The filter function allows you to apply a filter to a range or a table, but unlike the filter drop-downs that have been in Excel for years, this lets you place the result of the filter somewhere else, either in the same sheet as the data or, as I'm going to do, in a separate sheet. Let me show you. The first demo is based on a real-life spreadsheet that I built for one of my clients who is a PA at a law firm in London. This sheet displays all the expenses for the 3 lawyers at this firm for August. Each lawyer has a code associated with them: JSM, ALR and MBK. In the real-life spreadsheet, it was expenses for the full year, and there were about 70 lawyers. So this is a cut-down version for the demo. What the PA wanted to do was split the list so there was 1 sheet per lawyer. She would then generate a PDF from each sheet and send it to the relevant lawyer. But there's other things that you could do with the filtered data, like build a pivot table or build a chart or do further analysis on it. The filter function just provides a way to get that data from the main list. The data is in a table called lawyer expenses. If I just click on the table tab and you look on the left hand side, we've got the table name there and it's lawyer expenses. I created the table not because I was going to add more rows of data, but because it will make it easier to build the formula. I can refer to the table name rather than the range. To demo how the filter function works, I've already added it to the ALR sheet. I've put the formula into A2, and because it's a new function, it automatically spills. The way the function works is you put equals and then the function name, which is filter, open brackets. The first item in the brackets is the range that you want it to filter. So I could have put A2 to D, whatever, can't remember how far it goes down, but I chose to put the name of the table. That's what I was saying. It's much easier to use a table name when you're building a formula than have to specify the range. Then you put your comma, and then the second item in the brackets is what's called an include statement, which tells it which items, which rows, which records, call them what you like, are to be included. And in this case, it's the ones where the code column contains ALR. So the way I've referenced that is lawyer expenses, which is the name of the table back in the full list sheet. And then code, which is the column name, which goes in square brackets, and then equals ALR. Because ALR is text, it goes in double quotes. So it's saying, look at the table called lawyer expenses and return only the rows where the code column in that table is ALR. You can see that we've got the blue border, and because the original data is 4 columns, the spill range is 4 columns by however many rows. You can also see that if I click into any cell apart from A2, the formulas in the formula bar are greyed out. So I did that for ALR, and what I then did in real life is I copied that formula across to JSM and MBK and then just changed the second item. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually build the JSM one from scratch, just so that you can see how it works, and then I'll copy that across to MBK. So in A2, I'll put equals filter, open brackets. The range to be filtered is the table called lawyer expenses, and I only need to type the first 2 or 3 characters, and it appears in the list underneath the cell, and I can then just double click it. Then put a comma, and then the items I want to be included are the ones where the code column from the lawyer expenses table equals JSM. So again, I put lawyer expenses, open square bracket, and that gives me a list of all the column headings from that table. I can either type code, or I can click on it from the list to save me typing it, close square brackets, and then equals, and in double quotes, JSM, and close brackets. And what that does is that pulls out of the main table called lawyer expenses only the records that match the criteria. And then I will just copy the formula that's in A2, go to the MBK sheet, paste it into A2, edit the formula and change the JSM to MBK. Let's look at another example of the filter function. And I'll also introduce a couple of other functions as well. Here I have a list of sales revenues for a company that sells ice cream. This is the sales year to date, so it gets updated at the end of each month. And I've put the data into a table called ice cream. If I click on the table tab, you can see on the left hand side the table name is ice cream. Ultimately, I'm going to build a dashboard from this data. Now, I haven't got time in this session to build a full dashboard, but I'm going to build part of it, the part that will use the filter function. On the dashboard sheet, I want to have a drop-down list in E1 that lists the names of the countries in A to Z order. If we go back to the data, you can see that we've got the country names. For each country, we've got the different products and the revenue generated. So as I said, what I want to do on the dashboard in E1 is have a drop-down list that lists the names of the countries. The user selects a country, and in row 2 and below, in columns A to C, the dashboard displays the sales for each flavour for that country. Let's build the drop-down first. So I'll go up to E1 and go to Data and Data Validation. Then change the Allow to List, and into the source box I can type the names of the countries separated by a comma. But what if more countries get added to the main list in the datasheet? We really want the list to be dynamically generated from the source data. And to do that, we need to generate a list of countries and store them somewhere in the spreadsheet. For the demo, I'm going to store them on the sheet with the data in. So I'll just cancel out of the data validation, return to the data sheet, go up to F1 and put equals unique open brackets. Unique is a function, it's a new function, and therefore right off the bat it's a dynamic array function. What I want to do is I want to generate the list which will ultimately be used to populate that data validation drop down. So I'll select ice cream, which is the name of the table, open square bracket, click on country, which is the column heading, close square bracket, close normal bracket. So what I'm saying there is I'm saying look at the country column in the table called ice cream and pick out one instance of each item that's in that column. So when I press enter, there we go. The items are listed based on the order in the country column, hence it being UK, Germany, France, and so on. I really want them in alphabetical order. So what I would do if this was normal data is I would just click into a cell in column F, and I could either go up to the data tab and use the sort button here, or I can right click on one of the cells, click on sort and select sort A to Z. And I get a message that says you can't change part of an array. To sort the results of a spill range, you need to use the sort function. This is also a new function which is spill enabled by default. So what I'll do is go up to F1, edit the formula in there, click after the equal sign, type in sort open brackets, and then put another closing bracket at the end. In other words, return one instance of each item from the country column and then sort them alphabetically A to Z. So I'll press enter and you can see how that's worked. The sort function can sort text, numbers and dates. By default, it sorts in ascending order. If you want it to sort in descending order, you need to add an extra element inside the brackets of the sort function. Anyway, I'm going to go back to the dashboard sheet, go to E1 and go to data validation. Set the allow to list. And in the source, what I'm going to do is click back on dashboard data and then click on F1 and stick a hash symbol after the F1. If you place a hash sign after a cell reference in a formula or in a dialog box, Excel will reference the entire spill range associated with that cell. So this tells Excel to use all the values in the spill range generated by the formula in F1 on the dashboard datasheet. So I'll click on OK. I have my drop down and I can select any country from that list. But at the moment, nothing is happening. That's because I don't have a filter function. So I'll go up to A2 and type equals filter, open brackets. I want to filter the data that's in the table called ice cream. And the records that I want to pull back are where the country from that table, so ice cream, square brackets, country, close square brackets, equals E1. So I'm referencing the cell as the criteria. Close the brackets and enter. You can see now it's pulled back Germany, now it's pulled back France, and now it's pulled back USA. If I now go back to the data sheet and I just select these records for Spain, I only put those there so I can cut and paste them instead of me spending time typing some extra records. So I'll put those at the bottom of the table. The table automatically expands to row 31. You can see the end of table marker at the bottom of C31. If I now look at the list in column F, that has automatically updated and put Spain in the correct place because we used unique and sort. And if I go to the dashboard and click the drop down, I have Spain. Let's now look at the VSTACK function. The VSTACK function is another new function. It's used to combine multiple ranges or tables vertically, and that's what the V stands for. And yes, there is a HStack function if what you need to do is combine multiple ranges horizontally. In this example, I have 3 sets of data. Employees who are based in the UK office of a fictitious company, employees who are based in the company's French office, and employees who are based in the company's Spanish office. Each data set has been converted to a table. The tables have been named UK, France and Spain. Yes, I could copy and paste the data, and what I want to do is combine the 3 data sets into a single data set which will go on the full list sheet starting at A2. Yes, I could copy and paste, but even with 3 data sets, that's time consuming. Imagine you had 10 or 20 data sets. So I'll go up to A2 and type equals VSTACK, open brackets, UK, which is the name of one of the tables, comma, France, which is the name of one of the other tables, comma, and Spain, close brackets, and enter. And you can see that the VSTACK function has produced a spill range. Because the original data sets contain 7 columns, the combined data set contains 7 columns. So in this example, the spill range is 7 columns by 14 rows. Now, I mentioned the hash sign earlier in the session. If you include it in a formula that references a spill range, it references the entire spill range. Let me show you another example of where it can be used. In J1, I'm displaying the number of employees. And to do that, I've used the function equals count A2 to A15. That will count the number of non-blank cells in the range A2 to A15. Count A, by the way, isn't one of the new functions. It's been around since 1985. I didn't have to select A. I could have selected any column where I know there won't be any blanks. The problem with using this formula is that if more data was added to one of the tables in the UK, France or Spain sheets, it would automatically get pulled through to this sheet because the VSTACK function is referencing the tables, but the formula in J1 won't update to include row 16. So what I really need is a formula that counts the number of rows in the spill range. There are a couple of ways of doing it, but the simplest way is to use the rows function. That's another function that's not a new function, but it can be used in conjunction with a spill range. So I'll delete the formula out of J1 and I'll put equals rows, open brackets, A2. But I won't just leave it as A2, I will stick a hash sign after A2. And you can see that it's now selected the entire spill range. So what this function's doing is counting the number of rows in the spill range generated by the formula that's in A2. So if I now go back to, say, the UK sheet, and to save time, I'm just going to select one of the rows and copy and paste it to the bottom of the table. That has now expanded that table. Because the table is referenced in the full list sheet, that has now included that in the VSTACK, and if we look in J1, that has now changed the value from 14 to 15. XLOOKUP was added to Excel in 2020 and marketed as an improved version of VLOOKUP. Although in most cases XLOOKUP is used to return a single value like VLOOKUP is, it can return multiple values, which VLOOKUP can't. So this is a list of company-owned mobile phones, together with the details of the person who the phone's been assigned to. The idea of this spreadsheet is that you enter an employee ID into A14 and it returns all the details into B14 to F14. And to do that, I'll use an XLOOKUP in B14. If I wanted to do this with VLOOKUP, I'd have to create 5 VLOOKUP formulas, one in each cell across row 14. But as I said, XLOOKUP can actually return multiple values. So in B14, I'll put equals XLOOKUP, open brackets. My value that I'm looking for is what's in A14, comma. The range that I'm looking for that value is A2 to A9, comma. And I want it to return the values from columns B through to column F. Close the brackets. Because I've specified a multi-column range as the return array, which you can't do with VLOOKUP, when I press enter, it generates multiple values stored in B14 that spill across columns B through to F. So if I then go to A14 and change the value to 544, when I press enter, it retrieves the values for that employee number. Sequence is another function that was added to Excel in 2020. It's used to generate a list of numbers. And when I heard about it, my first thought was, why do you need a function to generate a list of numbers? But there's more to it than that. It's actually pretty powerful. Imagine you're the PA to the finance director and you need to set up a spreadsheet to track the repayment of a loan. The calculations to work out the monthly repayment and total payable, i.e. the amount plus interest, are in column B. But as this demo is about dynamic arrays and the sequence function and not about building a loan calculator, columns D and E are what we're interested in. The numbers in column D are generated by the sequence function. The first item in the brackets defines the number of rows, which is coming from B2, the number of repayments, assuming it is one repayment per month. The second item, 1, tells Excel how many columns to generate. So you can have sequential numbers, but you can create more than one column. If I go to this sheet here I've generated a 10 row by 5 column matrix of numbers. Let's go back to sequence 1. The third item in the brackets is the starting number. And this example, it starts at 1, but you can start at any number. And the fourth item is the step value. Again, in this example, it's 1, which means generate values going up in ones, but you can put any value you like. So if you'd started at 1 and put 2 as the step value, you'd get 1, 3, 5, 7, etc. Now, if I go to B2 and change that to 18, you can see what happens in columns D and E. So I'll just change that back to 12. The formulas in column E calculate the amount paid back to date. In other words, after 1 month, we've paid back 1 times 1758.32, 1758.32 being the monthly payment. After 2 months, we pay back 3516.64, which is 2 times the monthly payment, and so on. I did just say the formulas in column E, but actually there's only one formula in column E. It's in E1 and it's taking the monthly repayment, which is in B5, and it's multiplying it by D1. As I just said, 1 times the monthly payment. But because D1 is the start of the spill range, if I stick the hash sign after D1 in the formula in E1, it references the entire spill range, which I explained earlier. That has also turned the formula in E1 into a dynamic array, which means it generates its own spill range. So the whole tracker, columns D and E, is being run by 2 formulas. If I change the value in B2 to 18, you can see immediately what happens in columns D and E. The final function I'm going to cover today is choose cols, which lets you select specific columns from a range, a table or spill range. On the expenses full list sheet, which I used in an earlier demo, there's a table called lawyer expenses. I want to pull out the code and the amount for each row in that table and put them on a separate sheet. Now, of course, I could copy and paste, but any changes I make in the source data won't carry across. As you can see, code is the second column of the table and amount is the third. So I'm going to go back to the choose cols sheet. To save time, I've already added and formatted the headings. So in A2, I'm going to type equals choose cols, open brackets. The first item in the brackets is the range that I want it to look at, which in this case is the table called lawyer expenses. So I will put that in there. Then a comma, and then I put numbers which represent the columns from that table that I want to pull across. And as I said before, it was the second and third column. So I put 2, 3, close the brackets and enter. In E2, I want the code in the account from the lawyer expenses table, but only for the rows where the code is ALR. So again, I need to choose the second and third columns, but I want to do it not from the original table, but from filtered data. So again, I'll put choose cols, open brackets. But this time, as I said, the range that I want it to look at is not the original table, but the filtered version of that table. So I put the filter function, then As we covered before, the first item in the filter function is the range I want it to look at, which is lawyer expenses, comma, and then the second item is what I want to include, which in this case is the records where code is ALR. So I'll put lawyer expenses, square brackets, click on code, close square brackets, equals, and then in double quotes, ALR. Then I need to close the brackets, and that closing brackets matches the opening one from the filter. Then, as before, I want comma, and then 2, 3, and close brackets. So what that gives me is the code and the amount, but just for the records where code is ALR. Finally, earlier I used VSTACK to combine data from 3 tables into a single multi-column spill range. And the spill range begins in A2 on the sheet called full list. And what I want to do is pull out the first name, surname and salary of every employee, which is the second, third and 7th column of the spill range. So I'll go back to the choose col sheet and put equals choose cols, open brackets. Then if I click on full list and click on A2 and then follow that with a hash sign, that is another example of where I've used the hash sign to reference the entire spill range. Then I can put my comma and then 2, 3, 7. Close the brackets and enter. If I go back to the full list sheet, I can't convert the spill range into a table as I'd get a spill error. I don't want to refer to the spill range by its references A2 to G15 because the number of rows could change as people join and leave the company, so I use the hash sign to refer to the whole spill range. And that brings us to the end of this session. I hope you found it useful. As you can see, there's much more to dynamic arrays than a bunch of new functions. If you have any questions from today's session, I'm more than happy for you to email me or drop me a line via the contact form on my website. And with that, I'll sign off by saying, have an excellent day.